Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we have another episode of Adventures in Surplus starring this, a Japanese Type 38 carbine. Well, sort of. Actually, let me check my note. This is actually a Japanilainen Carbine model 1905. But no, I'm sorry. It's actually a carbine magazine caliber 256-inch pattern of 1907. And it's actually also whatever the Russians called the Type 38 Arisaka carbine, which I don't actually have a good reference for. So this is a rifle that served across 4 different militaries over the course of about 20 years. It's got a really cool story that's all documented in the gun itself, and I really like rifles like this. So without further ado, let's dig into this well-traveled Type 38 Arisaka. Let's start with a little bit of background here. It is, of course, a Japanese Type 38 carbine originally. Production began in 1906 at the Tokyo Army Arsenal. This particular example was manufactured in 1910. It's really actually a quite early one of them. There was, of course, a full-length Type 38 Arisaka rifle, as well as this short carbine variation. And the Japanese Army used both of them. They were very happy with them, and the Tokyo Army Arsenal manufactured these for commercial export as well as Japanese military use. There were not a ton of exports, but they did get out there. Interestingly, the Mexican Army adopted or purchased a big batch of these in 7mm Mauser in 1913. That's a subject for a whole separate video. But these guns are out there. The Tokyo Army Arsenal has made more than 2 million of these by 1923, when there's a big earthquake and fire and the Arsenal's production is shut down for a while. But just to put it in perspective, there's a lot of Type 38s floating around out there. And there are also a lot of Type 30s, which was a similar looking but mechanically different rifle that was developed by the Japanese and adopted just a few years before this. There are a lot of Type 30s manufactured, and then they kind of all become obsolete as soon as the Japanese Army adopts the Type 38. So those are sort of available. When we hit the fall of 1914, World War I has started in the West. Japan is not really engaged in the war, but has a whole lot of guns. And so when the Western powers all kind of collectively freak out and realize that this war is actually going to go a lot longer than they thought it would, and they're all going to need a lot more guns, well, of course, the United States is one place they go calling, looking for industrial capacity to build more firearms, but the Japanese Empire is one as well. And so it's actually the French at first in the early fall of 1914 who send out a somewhat frantic request to the Japanese government looking for some rifles that they could buy to supplement the Lebels that they have in storage, in reserve. Now, the French would end up putting the Berthier into mass-scale production, and they don't end up actually getting any Arisakas. They start the process, and then that process transitions over to the British. I think it's just a matter of the British had some better connections with various Japanese embassies and are able to facilitate the purchase of rifles more easily, because by November of 1914, the British Empire has acquired 50,000 Type 38 Arisakas. They will go on to end up getting 150,000 approximately in total. The records are weirdly vague, and it's very hard to find British mention of these, but they do show up from time to time. They show up in photos, and what the British end up doing with these is kind of, well, it is what the French would have done. It's what will happen in a bunch of cases with second pattern rifles. Non-standard rifles are given out to second line troops, people who need a gun of some sort but aren't expected to really need it. So one of the primary uses of Arisakas in the British military is issuing to crews aboard Royal Navy vessels. Boarding crews, security crews, marine detachments, those guys need some sort of rifles, but we don't really expect them to use them, and so we can give them a secondary gun with a weird logistics trail and different ammunition. These are chambered for 6.5 by 50mm semi-rimmed Arisaka. We can give that to the guys aboard Royal Navy ships, take their standard SMLE rifles in 303 and give those 303s to the infantry divisions who are actually really going to need the standardized logistics of ammunition and parts and support fighting on the continental front lines. So that's primarily what happens to the Type 38 rifles at the beginning. They get both rifles and carbines, as well as Type 30s. I mentioned the Japanese had a lot of obsolete Type 30s, also chambered for the same 6.5 by 50 millimeter cartridge. Those make great export guns, and they end up selling a bunch of them to the British as well. So the British take their Type 30 rifles that they get, and they take the Type 38 carbines they get, as well as some of the 38 rifles, and they get issued to a number of Army units as well, particularly training units and reserve units. Again, the guys who need some sort of gun, but don't necessarily need the standard top quality normal rifle for the Army. And this usage only lasts about a year. By the fall of 1915, British production of their standard SMLE Enfields has picked up. They're able to essentially re-equip all of the guys with Arisakas with Enfields, and they're left with, well, they don't really need all of these Arisakas anymore. So what to do with them? Well, guess who does need them right now? The Russians need them, because the Russians always need more guns, particularly in World War I. And the Russians have actually been also purchasing Arisakas from the Japanese this whole time. Perhaps a little ironically, given that they're barely 10 years out from the Russo-Japanese War, the Russian Empire is very happy to buy as many Arisakas as it can from the Japanese, and ends up purchasing, records are a little vague, reports differ, but somewhere between like 460,000 and 600,000 Arisakas of all different types from the Japanese. So that'll be Type 30s, Type 35s, which is the rare, unusual Japanese naval rifle, as well as Type 38s, carbines and rifles, both. The Russians get hundreds of thousands of these guns. And when the British decide they no longer need them, well, Russia is an ally fighting against the Central Powers, and so the British end up sending these Arisakas and air ammunition over to Russia. Of the 150,000 or so that the British got, about 128,000 get sent to the Russians. Now, the Russians proceed to do pretty much the same thing with them that the British had done. They issue them out to troops who need a gun, but aren't really expected to be in frontline combat, so that those guys, Mosin Nagants, can be redirected to the infantry divisions that do need them for that frontline combat on the Eastern Front of the Great War. And one of the places where the Russians will send a bunch of Arisakas is the Grand Duchy of Finland, or the Russian-occupied, not yet a sovereign state of Finland. The Russians have occupation troops there. There is always concern that the Germans may launch some sort of invasion of northern areas of Russia through Finland by landing in Finland. The Finns have a slowly festering national independence movement that's been going on, especially since the Russo-Japanese War. I mean, it starts many decades earlier, but there's a need for security troops in Finland, as well as this possibility of German invasion. And so there's a bunch of Russian troops in Finland, and that's a perfect place to send Arisakas. So we don't think they're really going to need them, but they'll have guns just in case. Well, in 1917, December 6th, 1917, Finland declares its independence, takes advantage of the chaos surrounding the collapse of the Russian imperial system. And Russian there's really not a lot of direct combat between Russian soldiers and the Finns. The Russians just kind of tend to go home. Like, they're tired of this, they're there on occupation duty, they're ready to go back to the motherland, and they leave their guns pretty much where they were. Now, there would be some Russian supply of Finnish communists and socialists during the Finnish Civil War, and Arisakas end up being used on both sides. There are tens of thousands of Arisakas left in Finland. They get picked up by the Whites, they get picked up by the Reds. They're used in this chaotic civil war for a brief period. And then after the Civil War ends, the Whites win, Finland declares its sovereignty, becomes a recognized independent state, and starts setting up its own military force. Now, Arisakas are really good guns. The Finns really like them. They're accurate, they're soft shooting, they're very well made, but there aren't a whole lot of them compared to Mosin Nagants. The Mosin Nagant is by far the most common rifle in Finland, and so the army standardizes on the Mosin Nagant. It takes a lot of the Arisakas that it finds, and it sends them over to the Civil Guard, which is the short version of it. The easy way is just to say, think of them as like the United States National Guard. They're a territorial force. They're a volunteer force that work with the army, but they're not part of the army. It's a complicated thing. Stick with. They're a subset of armed forces in Finland. And while all of the best Mosin Nagants are being taken to arm the army, the Civil Guard adopts the Arisaka as a stand-in rifle. And it will use Arisakas for about 10 years. It's about 1926, 1927, the Finnish Civil Guard is able to standardize on the Mosin itself, which is of course good. They want to standardize on the same thing as the army, logistics, supply, parts, all that good stuff. And at that point, the Finns start selling Arisakas out to anyone who's interested in them in order to get cash and parts for Mosin. So this rifle went from manufacture in Japan in 1910. It was then supplied to the British in late 1914 or early 1915. It was marked and used by the British. It was then sent over to the Russians, where it was used for another roughly 2 years before being left in Finland, where we don't know exactly what happened, but we know it was in Finland throughout the Finnish Civil War, and ended up staying in Finland until being imported into the United States just a couple years ago. So let's take a closer look at this rifle and let me show you how I know all of these things happened to this particular carbine. All right, we'll go ahead and start with the Japanese markings and then go to the British and then the Russian and then the Finnish. So first up, here on the front of the receiver, we have a stylized chrysanthemum with this 4-circle stamp on top of it. The chrysanthemum is the symbol of the Japanese imperial dynasty. This is the Meiji dynasty. The chrysanthemum means the emperor owns this rifle. It is also marked 3.8 type or 3.8 shiki. That just indicates it's a Type 38. These two holes, by the way, are not sporterizations. Those are vent holes, so that if you have a ruptured brass case, the gas will vent out of these holes and not come back to potentially injure the shooter. Type 38s did originally have dust covers on all of them. They're kind of attached to the bolt and slide with the bolt, so when the bolt is closed, they cover that designation, but they do not cover the imperial mark. Now, when these rifles were transferred out of Army use, in particular, for example, if they were declared surplus and sold to some foreign power, the chrysanthemum was canceled out. It was overstamped to indicate that this is no longer imperial property, and that 4-circle stamp is it's a stylized stack of 4 cannonballs. That's the mark of the Tokyo Army Arsenal. In fact, we see that exact same mark here on the side of the receiver, along with the serial number of the carbine and that mark indicating the factory where it was made. And like I said, this is a pretty darn early one. The initial production of Type 38 carbines would go all the way up to large 6-digit serial numbers, and this is only 34,000. All right, so those are the Japanese elements: the model designation, the canceled chrysanthemum, and the serial number. Next up, we have the British markings, and these can be in a variety of places. They will sometimes be like this on the right side of the buttstock. They will sometimes be on the left side of the buttstock. One of the other common places that British unit markings on these can be found is right here on the upper tang. In this case, of course, we've got right side of the buttstock, and we have a couple different things. We have a T, it's a serif T, and then 44TH, and I'm pretty sure this is not 44th. This is 44 of something something. Just that's the way that the British unit marks typically go. The letters will indicate the hussars or the yeomen or the infantry or any number of British unit names. We have PB and we have 430. So this is a rack number, I believe. I'm pretty sure about this. It's a rack number, and PB stands for Pembroke Depot, one of the British depots that handled Arisakas. And I'm confident in that because there are a number of other British marked Arisakas that have this PB mark on them that then went to a variety of other units. Unfortunately, I don't know what TH is, and I don't know what that T indicates, but the PB is a known thing that is on British Arisakas, and that makes me very confident that this is, in fact, an authentic marking. Now, when the British ship their Arisakas off to Russia, the Russians didn't do any markings on them. They didn't do any acceptance marks or proof marks or unit marks or anything like that. However, they did find a potential issue with the guns when used in the cold, and that was that this button, which is the magazine release, you push that in, and it allows you to drop the magazine for disassembly, for cleaning, or theoretically, if you want to unload the gun without cycling each round through the chamber, you can drop the magazine floor plate out. Well, the problem is, if you're wearing gloves in, say, cold, wintry places like occupation duty in Finland and you stick your finger in this trigger guard with a heavy glove, you can push that button in and drop the magazine and dump all of your ammo on the ground in a very embarrassing manner. And so the Russians, on some guns, but not all, again, like the British, this appears to be an ad hoc modification that was done by some and not all units. They added this sort of C-clamp little sheet metal strap that sits over the base of this button. So as long as that's in place, you can't push that button in, so you can't accidentally drop the magazine. However, this tends to slide down, as this one does on a regular basis, and then it's not so useful. There were a variety of different styles of these, some heavier than this. All of them seem to eventually have had this sort of problem, and the later Russian modification was just to grind off the inside of this button so that it was flush with the trigger guard. You'll find that modification as well. Again, sometimes it's not universal. It only shows up occasionally. You can, once it's ground off, you can still activate it, but you have to be much more deliberate in reaching in and push the flush element of the button to drop the magazine. So that shows us that this was a Russian used gun, and that's something that you will see again on guns that don't have any sort of British provenance to them, because most of Russia's Arisakas did not come from the British. Next up, we can look at the Finnish markings, and in this case, there's only one Finnish marking on this gun. And it's this one right here, PRI Garden City, Kansas, Japan 38 6.5. That is Post-Rock. That is the company that actually imported this rifle into the United States, and they imported it from Finland. I happen to know that directly. And so that tells me that this rifle came from Finland. When I combine that with the Russian modification and the British markings, that tells me exactly what happened to this rifle. Like the British and the Russian modifications, Finnish Arisakas can't always be identified by any particular marking, because there was no universal modification or marking that was done by the Finns. Some of these rifles were used by the Finnish Civil Guard, and those, if they were used in an official capacity after the Civil Guard started marking Civil Guard district numbers on guns, can be marked. This, for example, is a Type 30 Arisaka that has a Finnish Civil Guard district number on it. So this is a gun that was put into official Civil Guard ownership and service. It was issued out to this district and used by the Civil Guard. That's a very distinctive S for the Finnish Civil Guard. I will point out here, we actually have on this one that Russian ground down magazine release button modification there. However, this gun has no British markings on it at all. I think a lot of people would expect to see a boxed SA stamp on a Finnish used gun. That was a mark applied as proof of ownership by the Finnish army, and that mark didn't appear until after the Winter War. By that point, there were no Arisakas in the Finnish military, or virtually none. And so a Finnish SA stamp is actually more likely to be a sign of a faked rifle than it is to be a sign of actual Finnish use. However, the Civil Guard did use Arisakas long enough to wear out the barrels on some of them, and they actually purchased a batch of 500 replacement Type 38 Arisaka barrels from SIG, and those will be marked SIG on the side of the chamber, as well as having a Civil Guard crest right on the top of the chamber. Now, those guns are extremely rare, very, very cool, very valuable. I don't have one. I would love to have one. I do have some pictures of one. That's obviously a sign that a gun was, in fact, used by the Finnish Civil Guard. But these are rifles where, after the Finnish Civil War, a lot of them went home with individuals and never got any sort of official military stamp, or in fact, never were in official government or military ownership at all. Despite being used in the Civil War, that just because a gun was used in the Finnish Civil War doesn't mean that it ended up being the property of either the Civil Guard or the Army. The non-standard patterns, like this one, some of them were rounded up and inventoried and taken into official property, but a lot of them just went home with individual volunteers and soldiers and lived out their lives as hunting carbines or just rifles in the attic, and that's what happened to this particular one. It's worth pointing out when the Finns did get rid of these guns, they went out in a couple of batches. In 1919, pretty early on, about 10,000 Arisakas were sent to Estonia as military aid in Estonia's independence movement. And then when the Civil Guard re-standardized on the Mosin Nagant, a lot of these guns were collected up and sold. And 8,000 of them specifically went to Albania in 1928. So that's where most of them went that had been in official government hands. But the civilian ones stay in Finland. You'll still find them in Finland. Occasionally you'll find them rechambered to hunting rifle cartridges that were more available after the war than 6.5 Japanese. But yeah, that is the story of this Type 38 Arisaka. Finding a rifle or carbine with this whole provenance is pretty rare. These are actually very scarce guns to find. Half of the provenance is actually relatively easy, and that's the Russian provenance, because in addition to the trigger guard modifications, essentially we know that any Arisaka that has provenance to Finland has provenance to Russia, because that's the only place that they went. That's the only way that they got into Finland was from Russia. However, finding ones that are British provenance is a lot more difficult, because only a small subset of the Russian-used Arisakas actually came from Britain. A lot of them were purchased directly from Japan. And the British sometimes marked these guns, but they didn't do it as a standard practice. So if you have British markings like these, it is a definite, that's definite proof that the rifle was used by the British. However, lots of British guns don't have any marking, and without having some sort of historical documentary provenance on the gun, there is no way to know that it was used by the British. There are a number of things that can definitively rule out British use. For example, the vast majority of Arisakas in the United States came back from the Pacific theater of World War II with US vets. If a rifle or carbine has a chrysanthemum that has been removed by any method other than this sort of standard Army Arsenal 3 cannonball stamp, if it's been chiseled off, if it's been ground off, that definitely means it did not come out of Finland, which means it didn't come from Russia, which means it didn't come from Britain. Means it came from Japanese use. But ultimately, there are almost certainly at least a fair number of British-used Arisakas still in the United States that will never be identifiable because they just didn't mark them. It's really cool, and the reason that I'm doing video on this particular one is because it has that British marking. So I would love to find out exactly what that marking stands for. What is 44TH? If you have some idea, please feel free to let me know down in the comments. I'd love to solve that mystery. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Today's video has been brought to you by Headstamp Publishing, where we have a tremendous variety of extremely cool books that you might be interested in if you like guns and like learning more about guns. We have a couple different series of books. We have our flagship books that are academically in-depth. These actually began with my own very first book, Chassepot to FAMAS, on French military rifles. We have Jonathan Ferguson's book, Thornycroft to SA-80, on British bullpup rifles. Perhaps you've been checking out that Murdoch and Company EM85 and you think that's a pretty cool thing. Well, here is all of the background information you would ever want to know on the original British SA-80, what came before it and what came after it, what it developed into. We also have Rifles on the Danube about Hungarian AKs. We have Clockwork Basilisk about Collier self-cocking revolvers, a very cool, very much a forgotten early revolver that maybe actually should have invalidated Sam Colt's patent, perhaps. We then also have a series of more coffee table books. These are more photographic intensive. They still have a lot of information. You'll definitely learn something interesting out of them, but they're not really intended to be super in-depth collector's guides, rather an enthusiast's guide to a variety of different guns. We have our World War II series. Currently, we're in the process of filling out the whole World War II series. We have the Small Arms of World War II United States and Soviet Union available right now, as well as our book on battle rifles of the Cold War. That is currently our best-selling piece. People are really enjoying that, and I understand why. It is a gorgeous book on the inside. It turned out fantastically well. Very proud of it. We also have a number of other books that may interest you. We have one on Japanese imperial swords. We have one on tobacco of the emperor. Tobacco and pipes and cigarettes and matches are one of the surprisingly more common veteran bring-back souvenirs from World War II, and there's a lot of interesting history that you can get into with those. And then we even have a number of small pieces, things like Dolph Goldsmith's Arming the Dragon, about Chinese Mauser rifles. We have Who Invented the Wheel Gun, which is a compilation of a number of essays on the subject of, well, the early origins of the revolver. That was published in cooperation with Jonathan Ferguson's book, some of his work in there. All sorts of things for all sorts of firearm enthusiasts. So check us out at headstamppublishing.com. That link is in the description text below. We have standard copies, we have copies signed by the authors in most cases, and we have some truly beautiful collector editions in clamshell cases that are really nice. And of course, we still have a couple of books available for pre-order. So check those all out. Thank you guys very much for watching.